Julius Streicher.
Will you repeat this oath after me? I swear by God,
Ich schwöre bei Gott,
the Almighty and
Allmächtigen
Omniscient,
und Allwissenden,
that I will speak the pure truth
dass ich die reine Wahrheit sagen,
and will withhold and add nothing.
nichts verschweigen und nichts hinzusetzen werde.
It's done.
That was the voice of Julius Streicher. Now, Streicher is possibly one of the lesser known of Hitler's henchmen who surrounded him in the 20s and the 30s. And despite this, his contribution to the Nazi cause should not be underestimated. He was a fervent anti-Semite and is notorious in himself as having contributed mainly through the publication of Der Stürmer, which was again a notorious anti-Semitic publication used by the Nazi Party. And he was a bull-headed roughhouse political type from Nuremberg.
Wenn das deutsche Volk die Judenherrschaft in seinem Lande brach, so befreite es sich damit aus der wirtschaftlichen, geistigen und politischen Versklavung durch eine bluts- und damit wesensfremde Rasse. Die Judenfrage ist aber nicht nur eine Frage des deutschen Volkes. Der Ablauf des Geschehens in der Welt sagt jedem, der sich der Wahrheit nicht verschließen will, dass die Judenfrage schon seit langem zur Frage der ganzen Menschheit geworden ist. Der Völkerfriede wird erst dann in die Welt gekommen sein, wenn dem Nutznießer der Kriege die Möglichkeit für immer genommen ist, die Völker gegeneinander zu hetzen. Wer sehend geworden ist, der weiß, ohne Lösung der Judenfrage keine Erlösung der Menschen.
Julius Streicher is a very interesting character indeed. He's often overlooked because he doesn't occupy the same infamy that most of the other senior Nazis do.
Streicher was a committed Nazi, from 1921 through to the day he died on the scaffold at Nuremberg in 1946. Long after the other Nazi bigwigs had sought to distance themselves from the regime, Streicher stayed loyal to the end.
Streicher was one of 9 children born in Fleinhausen in Bavaria, and their father, Friedrich Streicher, was actually an elementary school teacher, and Streicher later followed him into that exact same profession. In 1913, he married Kunigund Roth, the daughter of a Nuremberg baker. And in 1915, they had their first son, Lothar. In 1918, their second son, Elmer. At the outbreak of war, Streicher joined the German army, and he served with quite considerable distinction. His qualities were recognized throughout the war, and indeed he won the Iron Cross. And by the time that the armistice was signed in 1918, he had managed to rise to the rank of lieutenant.
In February 1919, Streicher became active in the Deutsche Völkischer Schutz- und Schutzbund, German Nationalist Protection and Defense Federation. This anti-Semitic party was one of the various radical nationalist organizations that sprang up in the wake of the failed German Communist Revolution of 1918. The widely held view was that Jews had conspired with Bolshevik traitors in trying to subject Germany to communist rule.
In 1919, Streicher formed his own branch of the German Socialist Party in Nuremberg, and so his route toward Nazism had begun.
Streicher was really instrumental in forging many of the policies which underpinned the Nazi parties. We shouldn't overlook the fact that there was a great deal of competition within the party. There were those who were primarily nationalists, those who were socialists, and Streicher represented the anti-Semitic wing.
In 1921, Streicher finally found his mentor, Adolf Hitler, and his meeting with Hitler left him transformed. In fact, in his own words, he later said, "It was the last hour before midnight when his speech ended. It was an immense wealth of ideas that in a more than 3-hour-long speech came from his mouth, clad into the beauty of a gifted orator. When he was standing on the podium with a face radiant with joy and looking at the stormy enthusiasm, I felt that there had to be something special in Hitler. Everybody could feel it. This man speaks on behalf of a divine appointment, as a messenger sent from heaven at a time when hell had opened to devour everything."
Had it not been for the work of the likes of Streicher, there is a body of thought which suggests that Hitler would have probably moved on to other more pragmatic goals.
In 1921, Streicher joined the Nazi Party and merged his personal following with that of Hitler's, thereby doubling the party's membership. And with the exception of Dietrich Eckart, Streicher is probably the man who shaped Hitler's views on anti-Semitism more than any other.
From a very early age, we know from Mein Kampf, for example, that he was concerned to restore Germany's place in the world and to expand Germany's borders. That's what Hitler was all about. He was, of course, a vehement anti-Semite, but you needed someone like Streicher to help to propel anti-Semitism to the very forefront of the Nazi Party.
In 1920, Hitler had fallen under the influence of Dietrich Eckart, who certainly moulded his views on anti-Semitism. But it wasn't until Hitler met Streicher that his views changed and gained a rather rougher edge, and the viciousness began to emerge in Hitler and transformed him from somebody who simply disliked the Jews into the vicious mass murderer that he eventually became. Hitler was extremely grateful to Streicher because he merged his own following with that of Hitler's into the NSDAP. Now, another reason, not only that it doubled the numbers in the party, was that the following in Nuremberg had its own newspaper. Now, this publication, first of all, gave Hitler a more credible edge to him, but it also gave him a foothold outside of his Munich-based following into Nuremberg. And that expansion of his popularity made it possible for him to reach considerably more people and appear certainly more serious and more credible.
The merger provided the first rung on the bridge to the north and began the process of expanding the party beyond its Munich roots. From that point onwards, Streicher was a frequent and welcome visitor in Munich, and he played a prominent role in the growth of the NSDAP.
In 1923, Streicher began releasing the publication Der Stürmer, literally translated as the storm, but also loosely translated into the attacker. Now, the objective of this journal was quite simple. It was to spread vicious rumors and stories, anti-Semitic beliefs about the Jewish population, to smear them and to discredit them at every turn possible. The paper itself says, "We will be slaves of the Jew, therefore he must go."
So this is what the fuss is all about. This is an actual copy of Der Stürmer. This particular edition appeared from Nuremberg on the 10th of December 1942. We had the red to really bring out the lurid headlines, and I think what's particularly interesting, if we look down here, we see the famous byline which appeared on the bottom of every single edition. The Juden sind unser Unglück, the Jews are our misfortune.
Streicher's arguments were primitive, vulgar and crude, but he believed in what he said and was an uninhibited wild agitator to whom the masses would listen, which was what mattered to the party. Streicher sought to move the German socialists in a more virulently anti-Semitic direction, an effort which aroused enough opposition that he left the group and brought his now substantial following to yet another organisation in 1921, the Deutsche Workgemeinschaft, German Working Community.
The publication of Der Stürmer was significant not only because it was one of Hitler's favourite reads. Hitler used to describe himself as on thorns, waiting for its next publication.
It's a fairly small publication. There are only 8 pages in each edition, so Hitler didn't have an enormous amount to get through when he got his weekly magazine.
Streicher took part in Hitler's first serious attempt to seize power. As soon as the attempt began, Streicher was appointed as head of propaganda, a position which certainly suited his abilities.
Anti-Semitism wasn't a defining element of the Nazi policy, and what made it so was the likes of Streicher, who were close to Hitler and who kept that anti-Semitic agenda at the forefront. What's really interesting is once the decision is taken in November 1923 to stage the beer hall putsch, Hitler reckons he's going to be at the top of the tree and he's going to have to delegate the work of propaganda, which he'd always undertaken himself. He chooses Streicher to promulgate the message. As soon as the putsch is underway, Streicher splits from Hitler and he's seen addressing a huge crowd in the Marienplatz in Munich. At the same time, the others march on down Residenzstrasse, and this is where the confrontation with the police takes place. So when the firing breaks out, Streicher isn't there, not because of cowardice or anything like that, he's away doing a different job.
Many of the revolutionaries who were gathered together were attacked by the German police, many of them being shot at, and 14 Nazis were killed, along with 4 German policemen. One of the wounded was indeed Hermann Goering, who was shot in the leg. Hitler himself was knocked to the ground and dislocated his shoulder, and was later arrested and sent into incarceration at the fortress of Landsberg.
While Hitler was detained, Streicher kept the fires burning. His loyalty earned him Hitler's lifelong trust and protection. In the years that followed, Streicher would be one of the dictator's few true intimates. As a reward for his dedication, when the Nazi Party was legalized again and reorganized in 1925, Streicher was appointed Gauleiter of the Bavarian region of Franconia, which included his hometown of Nuremberg.
Möge es die deutschen Männer und Frauen für alle Zeiten ermahnen und hinführen zu jener Kraft.
Beginning in 1924, Streicher used Der Stürmer to launch attacks not only on the general Jewish population, but on specific persons. One of those being Julius Fleischmann. Fleischmann worked for Streicher's arch enemy, Mayor Hermann Luppe. And in this attack, Streicher accused Fleischmann of having stolen socks from the quartermaster during the First World War. And this accusation eventually went to court. Now, in the detailed examination, it was proven that Fleischmann had not indeed stolen the alleged socks, but other things did come to light. Now, although Julius Streicher was fined 900 marks for his false allegation, many other less savoury elements of Fleischmann's character were brought to light. And so Streicher's theory that whatever happens, something will stick, was proven in some way to be correct.
But the thing about this magazine, it was so tabloid and so down market that other factions within the Nazi party, Göring, for example, wouldn't allow his staff to read it. It was despised even by sections of the Nazi party. It's like the worst of the British tabloids to the power of 10.
To protect himself from accountability, Streicher relied on Hitler's protection. Hitler had declared that Der Stürmer was his favourite newspaper, and saw to it that each weekly issue was posted for public reading in special glassed-in displays, known as Stürmerkasten. The newspaper reached a peak circulation of 600,000 in 1935.
Although it was never an official organ of the Nazi party, it was something that was used to promulgate the anti-Semitic message. And they had Stürmerkasten all over the country where the Stürmer would be displayed in a glass casket. Now, you can understand just how powerful a publication like this is. It's actually endorsed by the government, it's pushed onto the population by the government, so it has a tremendous influence. People, the ordinary man in the street typically believes if it's in the press, it must be true. So this was a great example of just how powerful propaganda could be.
The slanderous attacks in Der Stürmer continued, and like Fleischmann, many irate Jewish people took Streicher and Der Stürmer to court in legal battles. Now, most of them won their battle against Streicher, but Streicher's objective was not to win legally. His objective was to promote his theories and his stories as widely as he possibly could, and the ideal platform was provided by the German press, who of course covered the legal battles.
He saw legal action as one of the weapons he could use to discredit local Jews, because even if he lost the case, he could throw around a lot of mud in the courtroom, and he could use that in the pages of Der Stürmer.
By virtue of his prominent position, Streicher also had a large part to play in the entrenchment of anti-Semitic policies.
Streicher and Der Stürmer alleged that the Jews were responsible for the depression that hit Germany in the 1920s, and that crippling unemployment was their fault. He also alleged that the Jews were white slave traders, and that 90% of the prostitutes in Germany were under Jewish control.
Streicher also combed the pages of the Talmud and the Old Testament in search of passages that painted Judaism as harsh or cruel.
He also accused the Jews of being responsible for many real unsolved killings around Germany. He also alleged that these were due to ritual murders that the Jews held.
Streicher's opponents complained to authorities that Der Stürmer violated a statute against religious offence with his constant promulgation of the blood libel, the medieval accusation that Jews killed Christian children to use their blood to make matzo. Streicher argued that his accusations were based on race, not religion, and that his communications were political speech and therefore protected by the German constitution. Streicher orchestrated his early campaigns against Jews to make the most of extreme possible claims, short of violating a law that might get the paper shut down.
The other thing about Der Stürmer that you have to realise, it had a slightly pornographic edge to it. There were often salacious stories about German maidens being interfered with by the Jews, and there was a salacious, titivating aspect to the magazine that certainly didn't go overlooked at the time.
Many of these essays and cartoons certainly helped to dehumanize the image of the Jewish people, and his cartoonist Philipp Ruprecht, also known as Phipps, specialized in cartoons which stereotyped the Jews. These images laid the foundations for what would later become the Holocaust. In 1933, the Nazis, in the position of the German state, gave the Gauleiters considerably more power, and Streicher didn't hold back in utilizing his newfound power. He began a boycott of Jewish businesses as a sort of a dress rehearsal for later anti-Semitic behaviors. Streicher consolidated his powerful position and increased his hold on Nuremberg until he more or less ruled the place outright. And this led to several nicknames. The King of Nuremberg, the Beast of Franconia. As the Gauleiter of Franconia, this also gave rise to the nickname Frankenführer.
Streicher himself couldn't resist the opportunity to enrich himself using his new power. He was seen as the King of Nuremberg. He was obviously the Gauleiter, and once the Nazis were in power, the Gauleiters had tremendous power. And Streicher actually was so obsessed, he began to abuse the power to the point where even the Nazis were uncomfortable with Streicher's actions.
Wir können stolz sein darauf, dass vom Frankenlande aus hinein in die Welt geschrien wurde, Hurra, Presse! Sie den Bacillus, ihr Völker seht den Bacillus und euch, es ist der ewige fressende Jude. Und wenn ihr wieder frei werden wollt, wie eure Väter es waren, dann macht euch frei vom Juden. Und ich sehe vor mir, wenn auch 1000 Wunden blutendes Volk, das russische Volk wird widerstehen, weil der Himmel es will, dass der Jude stirbt. Und wird sterben in jedem Fall.
In 1938, Streicher ordered that the great synagogue of Nuremberg be destroyed. When he was later questioned about this at the Nuremberg trials, he said that his reasons for doing so were not political or racist, but rather his objections to its architectural design. In the same year, 1938, he also published his infamous children's book, Der Giftpilz. And this particular publication contains such outrageous anti-Semitic claims that a publication of it is still on display at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C.
The title Der Giftpilz is German for the toadstool, or the poisonous mushroom. The book was intended as an anti-Semitic propaganda. The text is by Ernst Heimer, with illustrations by Philipp Ruprecht, also known as Phipps. In some instances, it is implied that Jews will try to molest children. One little girl escapes a Jew offering her sweets only when her brother calls the police, and when Inga's mother sends her to a Jewish doctor, despite Inga's protests of what she learned in the League of German Girls, Inga barely escapes his sexual advances. Communism is portrayed as being led by Soviet-sympathizing Jews who wish to sacrifice Germany to Russia's good. Rich Jews are also portrayed as abusing their German servants. In addition, the book warns of Jews in various occupations: Jewish businessmen, Jewish lawyers, tradesmen, and kosher butchers, who in one chapter are described torturing an animal to death. The same chapter also accuses the Jews of kidnapping Christian children to use their blood in matzos.
It's quite shocking to understand that this was actually used in classrooms to teach children about the evils of Jewry.
The book claims that the Talmud forbids Jews to do manual labour, and that Jews are only permitted to engage in trade, and that non-Jews are meant to be slaves. The chapter further states that Talmudic law allows Jews to cheat non-Jews, and asks Jews to enslave the non-Jewish population. Today it seems incredible, but in 1938 this book was used in schools throughout Germany.
Streicher's excessive behavior, you would imagine, would be popular among the Nazis, but in fact he was very unpopular with certain members in the hierarchy. One of Streicher's chief enemies was Reich Marshal Hermann Goering, who loathed Streicher. In the Nuremberg trials, Goering claimed that he forbade his personnel to read Der Stürmer at all. Despite Streicher's personal popularity with Adolf Hitler, his position began to unravel as he became more and more unpopular. He was accused of keeping Jewish property seized during Kristallnacht, and he also made some very wild accusations against Hermann Goering, claiming that his daughter, Edda, was actually conceived through artificial insemination. Now, of course, Goering fought back against him and proved this to be untrue. But these kind of rumours certainly knocked Streicher's popularity amongst the hierarchy of the Nazi Party. After a particularly verbal and furious attack on many other Gauleiters, in 1940, Streicher was stripped of his party power and forced to withdraw from the public eye.
As a result, he gradually fell from favour and he retreated to his estate on the outskirts of Nuremberg, but he continued to publish Der Stürmer even while he was in disgrace.
In 1943, Streicher's wife Kunigund died after 30 years of marriage. Despite this tragic loss for him, he continued his crusade against the Jewish people. In one of his own articles published in 1940, he actually says, "Whoever does what a Jew does is a scoundrel, a criminal, and he who repeats and wishes to copy him deserves the same fate: annihilation, death."
The physical task alone was tremendous. Hundreds of tons of documents, military, political, and economic, were assembled, copied, sifted, and translated. And from the files, the suspects emerged. Already many had confessed their guilt in suicide. Himmler, Goebbels, but others who had no wish to die were tracked down to their hiding places and summoned to stand trial.
Streicher assumed that because the Nuremberg trials were essentially a military tribunal, he would somehow not be required to even testify. I think he got the shock of his life when he was actually indicted as a defendant, because in his mind he saw himself merely as a newspaper publisher, and for that reason he expected to be acquitted at Nuremberg.
Streicher was indicted on count 1, planning to wage aggressive war, and count 4, crimes against humanity.
Although he wasn't a member of the military and did not take part in planning the Holocaust or the invasion of other nations, his central role in inciting the extermination of Jews was significant enough, in the prosecutor's judgment, to include Streicher in the indictment of major war criminals before the International Military Tribunal, which sat in Nuremberg, where Streicher had once been an unchallenged authority. Most of the evidence against Streicher came from his numerous speeches and articles over the years. In essence, prosecutors contended that Streicher's articles and speeches were so incendiary that he was an accessory to murder, and therefore as culpable as those who actually ordered the mass extermination of Jews, such as Hans Frank and Ernst Kaltenbrunner. They further argued that he kept them up when he was well aware Jews were being slaughtered.
He hadn't played a part in many of the indictments. He hadn't taken a part in planning for the war. He hadn't been active in the crimes against humanity in the sense of actually participating. But without doubt, he alone almost was the main catalyst. Ever since Hitler had met Streicher, he was in tow with a champion of anti-Semitism, and for that reason anti-Semitism had stayed at the front of the Nazi agenda.
23 different articles from Der Stürmer between 1938 and 1941 were produced in evidence, in which the extermination, root and branch, was preached. Typical of his teachings was a leading article in September 1938, which termed the Jew a germ and a pest, not a human being, but a parasite, an enemy, an evildoer, a disseminator of disease who must be destroyed in the interest of mankind. Other articles urged that only when world Jewry had been annihilated could the Jewish problem be considered to have been solved. It predicted that 50 years, hence the Jewish graves, will proclaim that this people of murderers and criminals has after all met its deserved fate. Streicher, in February 1940, published a letter from one of der Stürmer's readers which compared Jews with swarms of locusts, which must be exterminated completely.
During his captivity in Nuremberg during the trials, Streicher claimed that the Allied soldiers had mistreated him.
Meine hohen Herren, ich bin gefangen genommen worden und habe in der Gefangenschaft Dinge erlebt, wie sie uns, einer Gestapo, zum Vorwurf gemacht worden sind. Ich war 4 Tage entkleidet in einer Zelle. Ich wurde mit Zigaretten auf meine Brustwarze gebrannt, auf den Nabel. Ich wurde mit der Peitsche auf den Geschlechtsteil geschlagen. Ich wurde auf den Boden geworfen. Eine eiserne Kette wurde auf mich gelegt. Ich sollte die Füße von Nägern küssen. Man spuckte mir in das Gesicht. Man spuckte mir 2 Neger und ein weißer Offizier in den Mund. Und als ich ihn nicht mehr öffnete, wurde er geöffnet mit einem Holzstab. Und als ich um Wasser bat, wurde ich in das Klosett geführt. Man befahl mir, aus der Urinschale zu trinken. In Wiesbaden, meine Herren, hat sich ein Arzt erbarmt. Und ich gestehe hier, ein jüdischer Direktor des Gefängnisses hat sich dort korrekt benommen. Und ich erkläre hier, damit ich nicht missverstanden werde, die jüdischen Offiziere, die uns hier zu bewachen haben im Gefängnis, haben sich korrekt bisher benommen. Und die Ärzte, die sogar mich behandeln müssen, haben sich sogar aufmerksam verhalten. Aus dieser Erklärung mögen Sie ersehen, den Gegensatz im Gefängnis in Freising herein bis in diesen Augenblick.
As the trial progressed, I think the realization must have dawned on Streicher just how much trouble he was actually in. He wasn't going to be able to pass himself off merely as a newspaper publisher because of the huge weight of evidence that was ranged against him.
During the trials, Streicher was extremely vocal in his defense. He relied on the old theatrics that he had developed in the 1920s in his defense in court against people like Fleischmann. Indeed, he was so vocal, firstly in his defense, but also against the Allies and the credibility of the court, that he was repeatedly instructed to be quiet.
Now, will you go on?
Ich möchte das Hohe Gericht bitten, mir zu meiner Verteidigung eine sachliche, kurze Feststellung geben zu lassen.
Well, you really ought to answer the questions that are put to you.
Euer Lordschaft, das kann mein Verteidiger jetzt nicht sagen, was ich sagen muss. Das kann er nicht. Ich möchte darum bitten, die sachlich und kurz. Meine Verteidigung hat mein Verteidiger nicht so geführt oder führen können, wie ich es haben wollte, und ich möchte dem Gericht das bekannt geben.
And after a while, many of the other defendants, also senior Nazis, began to shun Streicher, fearing that his outbreaks would damage their own defenses. Although Streicher was quite obviously a fierce supporter of Adolf Hitler and many of his beliefs, the court found that there was insufficient evidence to prove that he was ever part of Hitler's inner circle. He was never actually a member of the military. And as such, they found it difficult to prove that Streicher had been directly involved in many of the plans to wage war against the Allies. Streicher wasn't even present at most of the meetings which explained Hitler's plans.
Although he was a Gauleiter, there is no evidence to prove that he had knowledge of the policies of military expansion. In the opinion of the tribunal, the evidence failed to establish his connection with the conspiracy or common plan to wage aggressive war, as that conspiracy has been defined. Israelitisches Wochenblatt, which Streicher received and read, carried in each issue accounts of atrocities in the East and gave figures on the number of Jews who had been deported and killed. For example, issues appearing in the summer and fall of 1942 reported the death of 72,729 Jews in Warsaw, 17,542 in Lodz, 18,000 in Croatia, 125,000 in Romania, 14,000 in Latvia, 85,000 in Yugoslavia, 700,000 in all of Poland. In November 1943, Streicher quoted verbatim an article from the Israelitisches Wochenblatt which stated that the Jews had virtually disappeared from Europe, and commented, "This is not a Jewish lie." In December 1942, referring to an article in the London Times about the atrocities aimed at extermination, Streicher said that Hitler had given warning that the Second World War would lead to the destruction of Jewry.
Streicher had charge of the Jewish boycott of April the 1st, 1933. He advocated the Nuremberg decrees of 1935. He was responsible for the demolition on August 10, 1938 of the synagogue in Nuremberg. And on November the 10th, 1938, he spoke publicly in support of the Jewish pogrom which was taking place at that time. In the face of the evidence before the tribunal, it is idle for Streicher to suggest that the solution of the Jewish problem which he favored was strictly limited to the classification of Jews as aliens and the passing of discriminatory legislation such as the Nuremberg laws, supplemented if possible by international agreement on the creation of a Jewish state somewhere in the world to which all Jews should emigrate. Streicher's incitement to murder and extermination at the time when Jews in the East were being killed under the most horrible conditions clearly constitutes persecution on political and racial grounds in connection with war crimes as defined by the Charter, and constitutes a crime against humanity. Conclusion. The tribunal finds that Streicher is not guilty on count 1, but he is guilty on count 4.
On count 1, planning to wage aggressive war, Streicher evaded a guilty verdict. But on count number 4, crimes against humanity, Streicher was not so lucky. After 25 years of writing, speaking, and publishing articles that viciously attacked the Jewish people and incited people to anti-Semitic and racial hatred, he could not escape that verdict. The court noted that one of his many nicknames was Jew Baiter number 1.
In January 1943, he wrote and published an article which said that Hitler's prophecy was being fulfilled, that world Jewry was being eradicated, and that it was wonderful to know that Hitler was freeing the world of its Jewish tormentors.
The tribunal found that even after Streicher had gained knowledge of the extermination of thousands upon thousands of Jews in Eastern concentration camps, he continued to write and publish his propaganda. His claim was that he was unaware of these atrocities being carried out. But in light of the fact that he was receiving first-hand accounts, and even in 1943 dispatched his own photographer to take photographs of the eastern ghettos, it seems hard to believe that he had no knowledge.
On Thursday the 18th of October 1945 in Berlin, the indictment was lodged with the tribunal.
Thus spoke Lord Justice Lawrence on day 1 of the 10-month drama now ended at Nuremberg. But we speak for the millions killed because of them, the burned towns, the widows, the fatherless, and the unspeakable horrors of the murder camps. This was the work of the Führers. Let us now have done with them forever.
Streicher claimed that his objective was the classification of Jews, and also aliens and transients should be found somewhere in the world, a place that they could all live together, preferably with global sanction approving this. Now, His publication, week after week and month after month, of inciting hatred toward the Jews plainly proved that this was not the case. Streicher's continual publications in Der Stürmer proved that his views toward the Jews were indeed racial and politically motivated, and this, under the definition put down by the Charter, defined it as war crimes and therefore crimes against humanity.
The charge of crimes against humanity. Accused on this count were Streicher and Rosenberg, authors and organizers of religious and racial persecution. They brought a new word into the language of human pain: genocide, the murder of races. The best means, they said, is organized underfeeding.
Pflanzt es in die Jugend hinein das Wissen, dass am Juden die ganze Menschheit zugrunde geht. Erzieht die Kinder zu einem gesunden Hass, zu einem gesunden Zorn, sagt den Kindern jawohl mit der Peitsche, hat sie hinausgehauen. Erzeugt diesen Hass!
In the early hours of the 16th of October, 1946, Julius Streicher and 9 other condemned defendants of the Nuremberg trials were hanged. Goering had somehow managed to get hold of a potassium cyanide capsule and committed suicide some hours before the actual executions. Streicher's hanging did not go as planned and was by far and away the more melodramatic of all of the hangings.
It seems to have been a bit of a botched execution which took around 15 minutes, and I think the hangman actually had to go behind the screens and pull his legs to actually bring about his death. But Streicher alone of all the Nazis remained loyal to the cause, and he actually jumped to his death shouting, "Heil Hitler."
The consensus among eyewitnesses was that Streicher's hanging did not proceed as planned, and that he did not receive the quick death from spinal severing typical of the other executions at Nuremberg. Kingsbury Smith, who covered the execution for the International News Service, reported that Streicher went down kicking, which may have dislodged the hangman's knot from the ideal position. Smith stated that Streicher could be heard groaning under the scaffold as he dropped through the trapdoor.
When he mounted the platform, he cried out his last anti-Semitic call of Purim Fest 1946, which is a reference to a Jewish story. The Jewish holiday Purim celebrates the escape by the Jews from extermination at the hands of Haman, an ancient Persian government official. At the end of the Purim story, Haman is hanged, along with 10 of his sons. Kingsbury Smith actually related the story of Streicher's death to a fellow journalist. He said that he was the only American reporter actually allowed to witness the executions, but Streicher's execution was horrific, even for those watching. Now, after the execution, Kingsbury Smith managed to find the executioner himself, John C. Woods, and ask him what happened once Streicher had dropped through the boards. In his own words, John C. Woods said, "I strangled him. I strangled the bastard." That the last thing as the hood descended over his head that was heard from Streicher was, "Adele, mein liebe Frau. Adele, my lovely wife."